Good afternoon, or if you are watching from China, good morning. So, hello, my name is Xu Xu. I am an assistant professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's book talk sponsored by the Julius Robowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance in the School of Public and International Affairs and the Center for Contemporary China in the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. It's really my great pleasure to be able to moderate this section and introduce today's speaker, Professor Yuen Yuen Ang from the Department of Political Science and the Center for Political Studies at the University of Michigan. Professor Ang is a graduate of Colorado College and Stanford University. She joined Michigan in 2011. Before joining Michigan, she was on the faculty of Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. So Professor Ang is a distinguished political scientist and China scholar. She is the inaugural recipient of the Theda Skocpol Prize for Emerging Scholar, awarded by the American Political Science Association for impactful empirical, theoretical, and methodological contribution to the study of comparative politics. She was also an Andrew Carnegie Fellow for her high-caliber scholarship that applies fresh perspectives to the most pressing issues of our times. So Professor Ang is widely published. Just to highlight some of her studies, she's been writing on China's economic development, corruption, Chinese bureaucracy, industrial transfer, political connections, etc. Her first award-winning book, How China Escaped the Poverty Trap, provides an innovative and sophisticated explanation for China's rise to the second largest economic power in the world. So today, Professor Ang will talk about her recent published book called China's Great Gilded Age, The Paradox of Economic Boom and the Vast Corruption. I had a chance to read this interesting book myself, and it's really fascinating and insightful. It provides a really a new perspective to one of the center puzzle of the current era. So why has China grown so fast for so long despite vast corruption? So her analysis is based on prosecutorial data, government compensation figures, news reports, and her own interviews with more than 400 Chinese bureaucrats. So I really learned a lot from this book. And this book also received honorable mention for the best book in comparative historical sociology by the American Sociological Association. It is quoted in the Economist and the Financial Times and the New York Times in connection with Xi's common perspective drive. It is also featured in the Economist's Cha Guang column and its podcast Money Talks. So we're really looking forward to Professor Ang's talk today. Before the talk, let me do a little housekeeping. So today, Professor Ang is gonna talk for like 45 minutes, and then we will take questions from the audience. There's a Q&A box, so please make sure you type in the Q&A box. I will be looking through there and pick up the questions. So probably consolidating some of them if there's a lot of questions. So today's talk is recorded, and the recording will be available on the YouTube channel of the JRC PPF. So Professor Ang, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Xu, for your very kind introduction, and a big hello to everyone. I'm really delighted to be here, and always a pleasure to speak to the Princeton community. Let me begin by sharing my slides, and I hope that it will share properly. Can everyone see the slides? Yes. Perfect. All right, great, wonderful. Let me just adjust my side of the screen. Okay. Again, thank you very much to Princeton University for having me. Although I received my PhD from Stanford University, I am also in some ways a student of Princeton. When I first embarked upon my academic journey, I was really fortunate to participate in Princeton's State Building Network, which was organized by Professor Atukali and his colleagues. And that experience launched me on a path to think about the historical origins and evolution of political economic systems. So today I'm very happy to engage with a different part of Princeton. And in particular, I also want to thank Professor Mian for having me. I'm delighted to share my new book, China's Gilded Age, which came out last year in 2020. Now, the title of this book makes an implicit comparison with America's Gilded Age in the 19th century. The term Gilded Age was coined by Mark Twain in his novel, and the term gilded means that you have an economic boom, but beneath the surface of that are many social problems. So the term gilded must not be confused with the golden age. Because my book came out in 2020 at the height of the pandemic, at the time, nobody cared about the Gilded Age, and almost nobody knew what it meant. However, if I could actually turn my slides, okay. However, a year later, things changed quickly because in the summer of 2021, the Chinese government launched an unprecedented, wide-ranging regulatory onslaught on private and tech companies in the name of rectifying the excesses of capitalism under the banner of common prosperity. And in this context, the term China's Gilded Age suddenly became a vogue phrase, appearing in The Economist, the Financial Times, the New York Times, and more. And I want to thank colleagues from all of these outlets for engaging with my work. If you rewind the timeline a bit earlier to July 2021, before common prosperity became a buzzword, Foreign Affairs quite presently released an issue on Can China Keep Rising? And in my article in that issue, I argued that China is in the midst of its own Gilded Age. And what Chinese President Xi Jinping is trying to do is to summon a Chinese version of the progressive era through campaigns and commands. So common prosperity must be understood in this broader context and not narrowly as a campaign only against inequality. Common prosperity is an attempt to tackle all of the interconnected problems stemming from China's turbocharged crony capitalist growth model. Now, today I'm going to attempt the nearly impossible task of shedding some light on this big question in 40 minutes or so. And the question is, how did China arrive at the Gilded Age with a paradoxical mixture of economic boom, corruption, inequality, and systemic risk? And for social scientists in the audience, I wanted to point out that the dependent variable, i.e. the outcome variable of this question, is not simply economic growth. Rather, it's growth with corruption and distortions. And this two-sided outcome applies to many other capitalist economies, including the United States. Now, to give the story some color, I'd like to begin with a tale about a particular Mr. Fu. Mr. Fu is a railway tycoon. He's known to lavish bribes and company shares upon powerful officials in exchange for state subsidies, cheap loans, and land grants for his construction projects. And these corrupt officials then indulge companies like Mr. Fu's, allowing them to inflate their cause and accumulate huge debts. So when you hear stories like these, it seems to expose the gravity of corruption in China. But in fact, Mr. Fu is not Chinese. He is American. His full name, Fu, is the Chinese translation for another Mr. Fu, Mr. Leland Stanford. Mr. Stanford was the man behind the Transcontinental Railroad. He played a monumental role in America's modernization. But his path to immense fortune was also paved with deal-making corruption and was linked to financial crisis. At the end of their lives, Mr. and Mrs. Stanford gave away their fortune to education, founding Stanford University in 1885, of which I am a beneficiary. As the Stanford historian Richard White said, in failure as much as in success, the modern world is made. And like it or not, we're all part of this fraught history. The story of Mr. Stanford serves to remind us that the United States and China may have more in common than we normally think. Now, in the current New World climate, China and the US are often regarded as two polar opposites with nothing in common. But I would argue that they are better understood as same but different, to invoke the title of a popular children's book. Since market opening in 1978, China has been undergoing its own Gilded Age, similar but not identical to the American version. One of the key similarities between the two Gilded Ages is that a particular type of corruption, which I call access money, elite exchanges of wealth and power, came to dominate, while growth-damaging forms of corruption were brought under control. And this type of corruption spurred growth, while at the same time producing serious risk, including inequality, excessive debt, speculation, and a populist backlash. But the two countries, of course, have completely different political systems. One is a two-party democracy, and the other is a one-party autocracy. And because of their different political systems, the two countries have responded very differently to the excesses of capitalism. One took a bottom-up approach, and the other, i.e. China, is now taking a top-down approach. To understand both the America and China Gilded Ages, how they came about, and how corruption and capitalism goes hand in hand, we have to begin by rethinking the very concept of corruption itself. Now, normally when people think of corruption, they think of it as a one-dimensional problem, something that you can score from 0 to 100. But this approach is misleading because it obscures the fact that corruption comes in qualitatively different types, and this cannot be reduced into a single score. So in my book, what I do is to unbundle corruption into 4 basic types, divided along 2 dimensions. The first dimension is whether that corruption involves elites or non-elites. For example, the president and his family, or street-level police officers. And the second dimension is whether the corruption involves exchange or theft. Corruption with theft is a one-way street where no one except the corrupt official benefits, whereas in corruption with exchanges, 2 parties have something to trade with one another. The intersection of the 2 dimensions creates 4 categories of corruption. The first is petty theft, such as extortion. The second is grand theft, such as embezzlement of billions of dollars out of state bank accounts into private accounts. And the third is speed money, i.e. petty bribes paid to low-level officials to overcome excessive red tape or delays. For example, if you need to get a license faster. And then there's a 4th type, access money, which is not the same as speed money. Access money are lavish perks paid to powerful officials, not just for speed, but for exclusive, lucrative access. For example, cheap land, government contracts, lax regulations, and tax breaks. And unlike speed money, access money can be legal and institutionalized. But in a developing country like China, such corruption is still illegal and personal, manifesting in the form of massive bribes. Here's another way to understand the distinction between speed and access money. Speed money are bribes derived from blocking businesses, whereas access money are rewards collected by helping selected businesses make enormous profit that they otherwise could not without the government's help. Like drugs, different types of corruption harm in different ways. Petty theft and grand theft are equivalent to toxic drugs. They're the most damaging because they drain public and private wealth. Then speed money is not as bad as petty and grand theft, but it does not spur growth. You can think of it as taking painkillers. It lessens a headache, but it does not help you grow muscles fast. Access money, on the other hand, are what I call the steroids of capitalism. Steroids are known as growth-enhancing drugs, but these drugs come with serious side effects that accumulate over time. Historically, we have seen these side effects play out in settings around the world. Crony capitalism and state capture contributed to the financial crisis in 19th century America, the Asian financial crisis in 1997, and most recently, the 2008 US financial crisis. Such a crisis has not yet fully erupted in China, but obviously the Chinese leadership is worried that it might. Now, here's a quick comment before I move to the next session. Before the Evergrande crisis, some readers would misrepresent my book as arguing that corruption is good for growth, and they would ignore the side effects and risk that I underscore throughout my study. And I think one reason for doing this is the tendency to worship growth as an outcome and ignore the problems that come with it. So allow me to stress, my book does not argue that corruption is beneficial. Rather, I argue that access money are like the steroids of capitalism, and we know steroids are evidently not beneficial. And indeed, when we look at the news today, we know that the side effects of these steroids are now showing up in China. Now that we have a typology, and we have these concepts of 4 distinct types of corruption, we can use these concepts to think about how China's corruption compared to other countries, and we can also look at how corruption in China evolved over time. So let's begin by revisiting how corruption is normally measured and conceived. Normally, we think of corruption as a one-dimensional problem rated from 0 to 100. And this is the approach taken by influential global indices such as the Corruption Perception Index, CPI, which is released by Transparency International every year. It is widely cited by the media and even in scholarly studies. And in this approach, rich countries are always rated as clean, whereas poor countries are rated as very corrupt. And in 2017, China was ranked more corrupt than Jamaica and Rwanda. Global indices like the CPI have done a great public service by bringing attention to the problem of corruption. But their concept and measurement of corruption is problematic and even misleading. Many times, users of the CPI do not really question how these scores are arrived at. So these are a few basic features that you need to know. The CPI is a perception-based measure that is based on surveys on experts, but this survey is actually not done in-house by TI. Rather, it is aggregated from existing third-party sources, which means that the CPI has no control over their methods, and scores can move up and down, not because perceptions have changed, but simply because sources have changed. And second, the CPI gives a single corruption score to every country, and it does not distinguish among different types. This is like sausage making. Different meats are mushed into one sausage, and you don't really know what has really gone into that sausage. And then the third is an issue that even existing critiques have not really pointed out. The design and wording of the surveys that were used are often problematic and extremely broad. So to correct the range of problems that I have just described in my book, I created the piloted version of an alternative index, and I call this the Unbundled Corruption Index. I'm not going to go into the details of the methodology, but you can find this in the book. The basic idea is that this is still a perception-based measure of country experts in 15 countries. But instead of asking them broad questions like, how corrupt do you think China is? I asked them questions specific to the 4 types of corruption that I identified, and I described for them vignettes, concrete scenarios of this corruption, and asked them to rate the prevalence of these scenarios. And then what happens is I aggregate the results by category, the 4 types I've just described, and I visualize them in this format. So what you can see in this example of China is that the total UCI score is indicated at the top left in brackets. And on top of that, you can see the composition of corruption distributed over the 4 types. China, like other countries, has all types of corruption, but the most dominant type, colored in orange, is excess money. So the advantage of the UCI over the conventional index is that we get to actually unbundle corruption and see how it is distributed over types. My pilot includes 15 countries, including India, Nigeria, the United States, and South Korea, allowing us to compare not only overall levels of corruption, but also its composition and dominant type. And as I emphasized, this is meant to be a pilot with a lot of room for improvement. But the point of this exercise is to begin to allow us to make systematic comparisons of structures of corruption across country. And so for the purpose of discussion, I'm going to focus on what I think is the most relevant pair, which is China and the US. If you look at China and the US, it's obvious that the United States is a lot less corrupt than China in total score. And this is also echoed in the CPI, where the United States is always rated as much less corrupt than China. But the advantage of unbundling corruption is that you can see that whereas the US has much less petty theft, grand theft, and speed money than China, on the level of excess money, they actually have much closer scores. The United States is quite distinguished in having quite a high level of excess money, not only compared to developed countries, but even compared to developing countries. That's not to say, however, that the quality of excess money in China and the US are the same. They are actually quite different. Whereas excess money in the US today is primarily institutional, taking the forms of, say, campaign finance, in China, it is enmeshed within personal relationships, and it still involves bribes and illegal actions. In that sense, we can consider China to be a more backward version of excess money. So if you're interested in hearing more about this discussion, comparing China and the US, a few weeks ago, I did an interview on Freakonomics Radio about this topic, and you can find it on the internet. China did not arrive at the current structure of corruption today. What I have just shown you is that the dominant type of corruption is excess money, whereas the other types of corruption are less dominant. Rather, this process took actually several decades, and now we are going to walk through in a few steps how this process unfolded. When China first opened up its economy in the 1980s, it was like any other third world country, plagued by all forms of corruption, in particular petty bribery, bureaucratic extortion, embezzlement, and misuse of public funds. One famous victim was McDonald's in Beijing, which in the 1990s was forced to pay many fees to local agencies. Most of them were illegal. And such petty extractive corruption also imposed a heavy burden on businesses and farmers. But entering into the 2000s, the situation began to change drastically. Data on prosecuted corruption cases from 1998 to 2014 provides some insights into this evolutionary process. Here, the corruption with exchange, the black line, measures bribery. Corruption with theft includes embezzlement and misuse of public funds. As you can see from this chart, in 1998, there were many more cases of corruption with theft than with exchange. Back then, embezzlement and misuse of public funds were rampant because monitoring capacities were actually very weak in China in the 1990s. But by the 2014, the patterns were completely reversed. Corruption with theft came sharply under control while bribery exploded. And not only that, since 1998, bribery has involved ever larger sums of money and more senior officials. In the case of this corrupt Minister of Railways, he was charged for taking some 65 million yuan in bribes, and this does not include his 350 apartments. Enough for one for each day of the year. So the important question is, what explains this change? Why did the structure of corruption in China evolve? And the first factor has to do with administrative reforms. In 1993, after Deng Xiaoping put the country firmly back on the path of capitalism and retired, a new leadership under Jiang Zemin took over, and their mission was to build institutions for a modern market economy. And to this end, they rolled out comprehensive administrative reforms, which quietly increased the state's ability to control growth-damaging forms of corruption. Simultaneously, the Chinese growth model actually shifted from manufacturing Sorry, I was interrupted by a chat box. Simultaneously, the Chinese growth model shifted from manufacturing to a construction, debt, and real estate. Because the central government drastically re-centralized tax revenue in 1994, it allowed local governments to generate revenue by leasing land to businesses. And by leasing land and using this land to borrow from banks, local governments launched an infrastructure boom in the 2000s. Some might be under the impression that China has always had an impressive infrastructure. In fact, this is only fairly recent. Only after the 2000s did China see a dramatic expansion of roads, railways, highways, long-distance cable, and more, in large part thanks to land-based finance. And it's worthy to stress that this method of taxless finance is not unique to China. It was also widely used in 19th century America to finance large infrastructure projects, including the transcontinental railways that was run by Mr. Leland Stanford. And like in America's Gilded Age, this mechanism accelerated China's growth, and it was also tied up with deal-making corruption. Government officials became more powerful than before because they now control land, loans, construction contracts, and had heavy influence over the lucrative real estate sector. And this is precisely why capitalists pay excess money or massive bribes to buy lucrative deals from politicians. And what are some of the risks and imbalances resulting from this political economy? One well-known risk is excessive investment and speculative bubbles in real estate. Because governments control land, this is a sector where power is easily monetized and offers astronomical rents. This is also accompanied by mounting corporate and government debt, which is now well known. In 2010, local government debt was, as a share of tax revenue, was 200%. Since then, it has increased every year, and by 2019, that number is close to 300%. And because construction and real estate offer such attractive gains, especially for those with political connections, this has resulted in perverse incentives among private entrepreneurs who are inclined to abandon the real economy for speculative profit. And this issue became serious enough that the State Council openly warned against it. Another outcome, as we now know, is rising inequality. In 2010, 2 years before Xi took office, China's Gini coefficient actually exceeded that of the United States. And such inequality touches the life of every Chinese person. For example, the rich people in China can buy many apartments and don't live in them, whereas the poor need housing but cannot afford them. So all of these side effects has generated economic risk for China, but they're not immediately reflected in GDP, which is only a crude measure of economic activities. More importantly, they also generate political risk for the CCP. Brazen cronyism and inequality undermines the legitimacy of a party that is communist in name. And it is in this context that the Chinese president has made a push for common prosperity. So I've covered a lot of ground today, and I hope to summarize by emphasizing 3 takeaway messages. My first takeaway message is that there are 2 sides to China's growth story. It is a story of impressive growth, but at the same time, this is accompanied by corruption, inequality, and risk. That is why the term Gilded Age is very useful for encompassing the 2 sides of this story. And it is not unique to China. You can find a similar parallel in 19th century America. My second takeaway message is that as students of development and political economy, we need to rethink glorified tales about modernization. There's a tendency among social scientists to think of growth as the dependent variable without qualifying the nature of this growth. And what I argue is that contrary to popular belief, modernization was not accompanied by the eradication of corruption, but rather by the evolution of corruption from thuggery and theft toward access money. And compared to the history of Western economies, China is a newcomer in this respect. And finally, for those who pay a great deal of attention to US-China relations, it's useful to keep in mind that the relations between the 2 countries are best understood as a clash of 2 Gilded Ages rather than a clash of civilizations. The US and China are obviously different in terms of their political systems and values, but it's less obvious that they share many similarities. And by keeping the 2 in mind, we are much more likely to have a rational, balanced understanding of relations between the 2 countries. If you are looking for shorter reads of my books, I wanted also to point you to 2 essays that I have written this year. One of them is The Robber Barons of Beijing, which is at Foreign Affairs and was published in July 2021. And for an even shorter read, you can find Ken Xi and China's Gilded Age in Project Syndicate, which appeared in September 2021. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and reactions. Thank you.